But adjacent to the SBIR conversation, I want to talk about tech transfer because you said something really interesting about the university system. And this is a fact that I'm very passionate about myself because people love their ideas. They're willing to sacrifice their life over ideas that have randomly occurred to them. But when I talk to them, and I love ideas, I do product development, right? I'm an idea realization person.
Yeah.
But the fact is that more than 90% of all intellectual property is not commercialized. And every time I talk to a university or I talk to a community, we're filled with good ideas. We're overflowing with good ideas to the point where, as an entrepreneur, if I want to improve my idea, I want to go to school and talk to people. But you said something about maybe it's not directly tech transfer, but just commercializing those ideas or supporting those founders coming out of universities.
Sure.
And that strikes a chord with me.
Yeah, I can talk more about that. So
yeah,
it's one of the pillars of our fund. It's one of our mandates. There is a whole lot of innovation happening within not just our research ones, but within all of the colleges and universities in the system. There are faculty that are working on ideas that they want to turn into products, that they want to turn into businesses. We talk a lot in startup land, startup world about valleys of death. One of the very real and apparent valleys of death is the point at which IP is maybe like a decade of money and research and time has gone into developing a piece of intellectual property, whether that's a biotechnology asset, whether it's a medical device, whether it's anything that is much higher risk, but potentially, much greater promise in terms of the kind of technology or the kind of product that it could become. That's typically what universities tend to do, like very high risk, potentially very high reward. Once that patent is granted, once that tries to step outside of the four walls of the institution, you're asking a lot of a very early stage investor to take a chance on something that's very, very high risk. The government and the SBIR programs and various other programs that fund early stage research, they're great at taking big shots at very high risk, but potentially revolutionary technologies. The challenge, I think, is that building the IP and transitioning out of the university is one thing. Building and scaling a company is often it's an entirely different skill set. So if it's a faculty member or an inventor that wants to take the reins of the company, and that doesn't happen all that often, honestly. Usually the inventors maintain like an advisory role with the company. And that's not to say that they can't run a company, but it takes a very different skill set. And running a business is extremely different and differently difficult than running a lab at a university. And so finding a team, finding a company that you can form that can help commercialize technology, that maybe brings in talent outside of the university to build a balanced team around the faculty member or the researcher or the staff member that created the technology. That I think is very, very hard to do. It's really hard to build teams, even in the best case scenario, but it's much harder to try to do that while you're also raising money and doing all these other things. So for us as a fund, one of our goals, like I said, we're trying to be a catalyst and bringing other investors to the table, helping companies find other sources of funding. And I think that the truth is just that grants can only do so much for you. As much as I love the SBIR programs and the MLI program and all of the other grant opportunities that are available to early stage companies, you can't do marketing and sales, those funds. They're for R&D, which is critical. But you almost always need other outside capital to be able to support a company and the sort of infrastructure that goes along with building a business. So that I think is where there's generally this gap of people willing to, funds, institutions willing to take an early shot. I think foundations can do a lot there too. There's always a point where a company needs to start raising money. And often that's from angel investors, angel groups, pre-seed funds, seed funds. And that's where we try to play a catalytic role. We try to help companies find other investors, bring other people to the table. One of the things I forgot to mention at the top, which I probably should have, is that we're a matching fund. Unlike TEDCO or any other fund or an angel that could set terms, issue a term sheet, we don't do that. And that's by design. We're a small fund. We're not writing huge checks. We want to find other investors to lead rounds, set terms. We participate on those terms. We also have to have companies raise matching capital. It offsets the risk for us, but it also encourages companies to go out and raise from other sources in addition to ourselves. So there's no, and I could probably ramble on and stop me, but I will say it's different depending on the technology. Mm-hmm. So often it's the case that we're working with biotech companies, which are years out from revenue. Other mm-hmm. times it's software, which is much closer to revenue, might even be revenue positive by the time it moves out of the university. So what every company needs as a result is going to be very, very different, particularly depending on what type, technology vertical they're operating in.
Yeah, it makes sense. With hard tech, certainly even the SBIR, you're not going to get far enough along where you're revenue positive and building inventory and building out the actual execution level team that you need. But it's nice to know that those opportunities are lined up, that there's someone to go pitch to get validated. There's programs out there to get 10K, 20K, 50K. There's people who are willing to angel invest. There's programs that are willing to give us a 6-figure check. And if we can line up those opportunities logically, we can create a funding path to do whatever needs to get done, right? It doesn't matter the industry. So it's great as long as you know where it fits in that model, right?
Yeah. And I'll say one thing that I've learned since starting this job is just how much the tech transfer landscape has really evolved in the last maybe 20, 25 years. It used to be the case that Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, all these other massive pharmaceutical companies would have very close direct relationships with the universities, and they would talk with PIs. They would maybe be funding labs. Some of that still happens, but it used to be the case that they would license technology much closer to when it comes out of the university. So much closer to the phase of exploratory R&D, early animal data, positive results, tracking well. Let's acquire this or license it and bring it through phase 1. That doesn't happen so much anymore. It is now much more likely that those larger pharma companies have their own venture funds, or they have licensing agreements that sort of kick in around the phase 1, maybe even after that, because they don't want to license, but they won't take it off the company's hands. There'll still be a startup that's running the trial, that's working with the CRO, that's doing all that other stuff. But there's just this risk aversion around. It is no longer the case that enterprises want to acquire or license R&D. They want product. They want something that is much further along. And so I think that's become the added challenge, is that it's a lot harder for tech transfer, and then companies are formed around IP that's been transferred out to get the attention of large industry when they maybe 20 years ago would have had much less problem doing so. Mm-hmm. Like that's where there's this added emphasis and importance for academic institutions to continue to fund the most promising of those ventures, because otherwise they very well may struggle. And then, at that point, it doesn't matter what royalty agreement you have with the company. If it doesn't go anywhere, then you don't get any royalty and the patent goes away or gets pulled back to the institution. So
that makes sense.
That's the thing that I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah. For me in hardware, that's normal. And in defense hardware, that's absolutely normal. It's generally investment looks like acquiring your small business, but, right. but yeah, it's interesting to see how those markets move.